So Verona Pharma, we're dual listed on AIM and on NASDAQ. So the usual forward-looking statements. There's quite a full slide deck. I will skip over some of them in the interests of enabling us to finish on time. But basically, the company has a single asset, which is a compound called ensifentrine, RPL554. It has a dual mode of action. It works as both a bronchodilator and an anti-inflammatory for the treatment of respiratory diseases. Our initial focus is on COPD. And it has a dual mode of action by inhibiting PDE3 and PDE4 enzymes. The PDE3 is more associated with improvement in bronchodilation, and the PDE4 with the reduction in inflammation. The COPD, it's not the hottest area, but it is big. So if you take the US, for example, there's around 15 million patients who are diagnosed, 6 million on treatment in the IMS database. If you look at it is the third leading cause of mortality in the US. A lot of airtime is given to the opioid crisis, and that is a great tragedy. And that's around 45, 46 people dying every day. With COPD, it's nearly 10 times that. But it's a silent disease because it's elderly patients who progressively deteriorate. They end up being housebound. They have a much lower, much less visible. But it is a real unmet need. So in terms of the two ways to treat the bronchodilation and the inflammation, it's the smooth muscles around the small airways that constrict and cause the bronchoconstriction. If you can relax those, you can open up the airways, and then if you can treat the inflammation as well within the lining of the small airways, again you can open things up. So both bronchodilation and anti-inflammation are important things. There are good bronchodilators that work well in COPD patients. I'll come on to those in a moment. But there's only two classes, and once you're on maximum bronchodilation therapy, there's not a lot else that you can do. And there's one anti-inflammatory which is poorly tolerated. The mainstay of inflammation treatment in asthma is inhaled steroids. Those work really well in asthma, but it's a different inflammatory mechanism in COPD. Inhaled steroids don't really work well. So just to how quickly do patients progress? So if you take John, for example, diagnosed, put on a single bronchodilator, within 12 months, poor symptom control, put onto a second bronchodilator, and that's it. There's no more classes of bronchodilation. So once you're on LAMA and LABA, that's it. And what's the physician going to do? But the patient's still struggling to breathe, still have a life expectancy of 10, 15 years. It's about trying to improve the quality of life. So new modes of action that can add additional bronchodilation are important, and having an anti-inflammatory that patients can tolerate is the other goal. So, as I said, in the last 40 years, there have been no new classes of bronchodilators. There have been improvements. They're more convenient. You go from taking short-acting bronchodilators 6 times a day down to having once a day. And they're good. They're good products, the LABAs and the LAMAs. But there's a need. 40% of patients are still uncontrolled and need additional bronchodilation. On the anti-inflammatories, as I said, the inhaled steroids don't work in COPD particularly. They treat the eosinophils that you get in asthma, but in COPD and also in cystic fibrosis, the inflammation is caused by neutrophils. There is one PDE4 inhibitor on the market, roflumilast. It's taken orally. It works very well. It reduces the exacerbations dramatically, over 30% reduction in exacerbations, but it has a significant GI side effect profile: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, weight loss. Patients don't tolerate it well and rarely stay on it. So that's the existing market. In terms of development, well, there's not a lot of things to get patients excited. On the bronchodilators, there are more LABAs and LAMAs. There are single molecules which inhibit both the muscarinic and beta-2 receptors. But that's just the same as having a dual combination therapy in a single molecule. On the anti-inflammatory side, there are some biologics. They may work, and that would be great, but they're not going to be cheap. Ensifentrine is a small molecule with a small molecule cost of goods, and I think would sit before any any biologics that get to market. There is an inhaled PDE4 that may work, but again, it doesn't provide the bronchodilation. The only compound that we know of which has the combined bronchodilator and anti-inflammatory mode of action is ensifentrine. So I won't spend too long on the biology, but you can see on the inflammation side in particular, PDE4 will knock down a broad spectrum of inflammatory cells. So yes, it does the eosinophils like the inhaled steroids, but it will also reduce the neutrophils and macrophages and other inflammatory cells. So if you take those 6 million patients in the US who are being treated, 3 million of them are on a monotherapy bronchodilator, but 40% of them are not symptom controlled. So they progress either onto dual therapy or you can move them on to ensifentrine. But our preferred positioning is to go on as a last line therapy on top of dual bronchodilator therapy. That's 2 million patients. Again, 40% of them are uncontrolled. That's 800,000 patients. The WAC for a nebulized product, there are some nebulized bronchodilators on the market in the US, monthly WAC of $1,000, call it $10,000 per annum. 800,000 patients, that's an $8 billion market opportunity. So you don't have to get very many patients to have a blockbuster. What else do you go on to? Oxygen therapy, try antibiotics, there's a range of other things, but again, you've got no real working additions on top of dual bronchodilator therapy. I'll skip through these slides relatively quickly in the interest of time, but just to look at some data. This is the data we produced last month. Up front, the primary endpoint we picked was peak FEV1 improvement. We missed that by a narrow margin. We've done 13 studies over 100 patients. We know it's not a problem with the drug. There were some refinements in the trial design that we could have done that would have given us a better outcome. But you can see over 0 to 4 hours, the 1.5 milligram dose did achieve statistical significance, and both doses achieved statistical significance after the evening dose. In residual volume, this is the amount of air, a measure of the amount of air that's trapped in the lung. Again, you can see, particularly in the evening doses, a really statistically significant improvement. And that's important because the LAMAs and LABAs, they're designed to be taken once a day. And so you do have an erosion of benefit during the day, and particularly overnight. If you can control the symptoms and improve the breathing and the condition of the patients overnight, the majority of exacerbations, hospital visits, take place in the morning because the patients have a difficult night. The existing long-acting agents take up to 2 hours to start having an effect. So when you wake up, you're struggling to breathe, you take your medicine, you're still struggling to breathe, and that's when you typically have the hospital visit. So I think, again, if you can improve the position overnight, that's a real opportunity. This was on top of a single bronchodilator. Here you can see the 6 milligram dose performed much better. Honestly, there is a debate ongoing, and we will look at that in the next study. Is there much additional benefit between 6 milligram and 1.5 milligram, or are you on the plateau? And that's something we will explore in the next study. But here you can see on top of Spiriva, one of the most commonly used long-acting antimuscarinics, a very clear improvement at the morning, statistically significant improvement in the residual volumes again at the morning. And the other interesting thing, which again we think from a patient perspective is very interesting, is the much faster time to onset. So Spiriva, as I said, it's a great drug, but it takes up to 2 hours to have maximum benefit. This was measuring time to 50% of peak benefit. And you can see tiotropium, that still took around 40 minutes. You take it in combination with RPL554, you reduce that to 5 minutes. So that's a really rapid feeling of improvement for patients. We think that's also really interesting and important. So we've done a number of studies on top of single agents and one on top of dual bronchodilator. People have asked what is the impact of inhaled steroids. Obviously, the standard of care could well become GSK's Trelegy Ellipta as 2 bronchodilators and an inhaled steroid. We find that the patients we recruit are between 30 and 50% of them in the studies are on inhaled steroids. If they're on a stable dose of inhaled steroids, they maintain that throughout the study. In the subgroup analysis, we don't see any difference between those who are on steroids or not. So the last study I was going to run through, this was a 4-week study we did in 400 patients in Europe, around 45 centres. And again, this was looking at dose ranging. As I said, one of the questions we've had is, does the 6 milligram dose add anything? So you can see here 4 doses from 0.75 milligram up to 6 milligram. We know in asthmatics we have seen a very clear dose response. In COPD patients, the lung pathology is different. There is less healthy lung in there, so potentially the higher doses may not be adding quite so much. It's not visible on this, but you can look at rescue medication amongst the in the lowest dose group. We saw that was significantly higher. So we do think there is certainly that bottom dose we think is not quite on the plateau, even if in terms of bronchodilation it's looking similar. In terms of the anti-inflammatory effect, there are no validated biomarkers, but what you can look at is progressive improvement in symptoms. So this is, we used SGRQ, which is a validated patient-reported outcome. We also looked at Exact Pro, which again, the FDA is a keen supporter of. And you can see progressive improvement over the 4 weeks. Now, if you take just the bronchodilator, you'll get an immediate benefit, an immediate improvement in symptoms, but the progression from week 1 to week 2, week 2 to week 3, there's not going to be anything changing. The patients will be on a stable bronchodilation. So we think, and the KOLs agree, that this progressive improvement week on week is due to the anti-inflammatory activity of ensifentrine. So we've also seen that we've looked at the data on top of Spiriva as a long-acting antimuscarinic. We've also shown it on top of short-acting beta-agonists and short-acting antimuscarinics. It's very consistently good bronchodilation effect, and most importantly, unlike roflumilast, even over 4-week studies, we've not seen any of the GI effects that you would see with roflumilast. So we think it's a nice clean compound. The only thing we've seen was around 3 beats per minute increase in the highest dose group, which lasts for a couple of hours post-dosing. If you've taken salbutamol, or any of your family members have, and you start taking 20 puffs of that, you see a very substantially higher increase in heart rate. We will do one further study before the end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA, which will be another 4-week study on a single bronchodilator background. We only want to take a single dose into phase 3. We know if we go to the FDA with the data we've currently got, they'll just say, well, go with the lowest dose. We just want to explore and make sure if the doses all come out again the same on an anti-muscarinic background, then all right, there probably isn't much to add from a higher dose, but we want to just make sure we've proven that, and that will substantially de-risk the phase 3 as well. In terms of payers and commercial opportunity, so as I mentioned, a WAC price for the existing nebulized treatments of around $1,000 per month before discounts, but in the nebulizer formulation, discounts are much lower than for the inhalers. It's around 10 to 15%. Nebulizer usage is higher in the more severe group, at around 20%, but actually there's around 50% of COPD patients in the US have a nebulizer at home. The nebulizer device is reimbursed under Part B Medicare, and that's very different to Europe, where the device is not reimbursed. I think there is, you can cut the 800,000 patients by 20% and say that's the addressable market, but actually there's not much you can take through a nebulizer at the moment. There are 2 nebulized LABAs, Perforomist and Verona. They sell around $550 million per annum. They're only approved in the US. There are 2 now LAMAs that are approved in the US. Lonhala, which is a closed system. That means it's reimbursed under Part D Medicare. It's an antimuscarinic, but the take-up may be more difficult due to the higher copay for patients. They can take an antimuscarinic through an inhaler, so do they want to pay more to be able to take it through a nebulizer? And then there's revefenacin, Yupelri, which was approved in December, Mylan and Theravance. It'd be interesting to see how that progresses. But we think if you give patients something which is only available through a nebulizer, they'll be willing to take it because many of them are on oxygen therapy already. It's not that taking something through a nebulizer is a significant burden for them. We've done significant payer and physician research. What we think we need to show in the phase 3 is bronchodilation but that can be on a range of different backgrounds, plus a trend to symptom improvement. We are not going to be trying to do exacerbation studies as a registration study. Those are 12-month studies, and they are large and expensive. We think you can treat patients for 6 months, get symptom data. You only have to treat for 3 months to get bronchodilation, but on its own, I think that's enough. So we would look to doing two 6-month studies, and then potentially some smaller positioning studies to provide some additional data on, for instance, on residual volumes in the lungs and some other symptom approaches. I'll just skip through this. COPD is the initial target indication. We think there is an opportunity as well to look at the acute patients in hospital. We know that 20% of patients after being admitted to the ward will return to hospital within 30 days. That's a significant economic issue. We think if you can get patients post-discharge onto ensifentrine, again, if they respond well, as a clinician, would you take them off? So we think that's an interesting recruitment area. CF, we've shown that it works in CF patients. We did look quite carefully at whether that was a quicker route to market. But I think the challenge is there that Vertex has tended to make the studies longer. And so in terms of accessing patients and the length of the studies you need to do, we don't think it's any quicker to get to market in CF. But we do think it's a study that we should do because we have an effect on the CFTR channel very similar to Kalydeco. We've actually shown in preclinical models it's additive on top of Kalydeco. But most importantly, CF patients don't have anti-inflammatories they can tolerate. So we think that there is an opportunity to treat a mutation-agnostic approach to provide anti-inflammatory benefit to CF patients. Severe asthmatics, most asthmatics are well treated with cheap generic therapies, but you look at the market positioning of Nucala, Fasenra, and so on, there is an opportunity to provide further therapy for severe asthmatics, and if you have a small molecule that could sit one line below the biologics. And then there's a range of other rare respiratory diseases, which again we think RPL 554 could be developed for. I'll gallop through the next few slides and just maybe stop on the on the numbers. Being the CFO, I feel guilty if I didn't at least have some passing reference. So a strong cash position, $90 million at September 30th. Because we missed the primary endpoint, we did get severely penalized following the data release, so we're now trading at pretty close to cash. We think that that's yes, would say that being the company, but we think that's a misunderstanding by a relatively small volume of trades that primarily from retail. We have a great list of investors. We do think that we've shown the drug works. There's not a question about that. It was a 3-day study to provide some design cues in the most challenging patient population on maximum therapy. We showed 50 ml of improvement. That's clinically what the physicians are looking for as something which patients will notice. So, yeah, we've taken a hit, but we think there's a good story. We've got the funding in place to complete the phase 2 studies and still have a strong cash position thereafter, with 12 months runway beyond the completion, and a good list of shareholders. So we're continuing on and just trying to get repeat the message that actually the share price reaction is overdone, and that there is a real position. We understand what the issues were with the last study, and it's better to make those mistakes now than in the phase 3.
Thank you very much.